Senate Bill 1264 is by for the day. Turning to page 18, similarly, Senate Bill 1315 is by for the day. Therefore, the bill before us, Senate Bill 1362, a bill to amend and reenact a section of the code relating to carrying concealed weapons, exemption for non-duty status active military personnel. The bill was Board of Committee Militia, Police, and Public Safety with an amendment. And, Mr. Speaker, there is, the amendment's been agreed to, and there is a floor amendment.
The gentleman from Prince William, Mr. Lingenfelder.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would request the clerk report the amendment.
Clerk will report a floor amendment.
Floor amendment offered by Delegate Lingenfelder on line 52 of the bill, line 52, after the word guard, comma, strike the Virginia Defense Force.
Gentleman, Prince William.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this amendment arose out of a discussion we had yesterday about the Virginia Defense Force. The bill actually doesn't address carrying weapons when they're actually doing their duty. However, I spoke to the patron. We looked behind some of the issues, and it was determined that it was probably best to remove them because it doesn't affect a lot of the Virginia Defense Force in the first place. So that's the amendment. I would request we pass the amendment.
Questions on adoption of the floor amendment offered by the gentleman from Prince William. As many as favor that motion will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The floor amendment is agreed to. Shall the bill pass? Oh, excuse me, gentleman from Fairfax, Mr. Simon.
Speaking to the bill.
Gentleman has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, members of the House, I rise to speak to this bill. As many of you know, I am a veteran myself. I served in the U.S. Army. I was an officer, and at the risk of sounding like the current president, no one has more respect for the people that serve in the military and protect our lives and put their lives on the line and are subject to being called into harm's way at any moment than I do. But there's a problem with this bill. This bill hasn't been thought out very thoroughly. The gentleman's amendment makes it a little bit better. It hadn't occurred to anybody, as this went through committee, that we were going to have Virginia Defense Force folks carrying their private weapons around without a permit on the basis of their military ID, and they'd have to check that somewhere when they went on to active duty. So we took that out, and that makes it a little bit better, but there are a lot of other unforeseen consequences that we haven't seen there. You know, and as an Army prosecutor, I got to see a little bit different side of the military. Okay, and maybe, you know, it's jaded. Maybe because I saw folks at their worst. Maybe it's because I had to deal with the folks that had domestic abuse problems going on. I had to deal with folks that were suffering with substance abuse issues. Maybe it's because I had to deal with the people that came off of reserve duty and were looking to get on active duty because they needed a job to support their drug habit. And so the day that he got his TDY orders and got his rental car, he sold it, checked into his hotel, and sold the TV out of his hotel room the first minute he got it. Those are the folks that I had to deal with every day. That was my job, to go in, and I had to deal with the worst of what was going on, because the military, like any other community, has its share of really great folks, right? But not everybody is a hero all the time. And sometimes you get folks that are in a bad way or suffering. And actually, the military, because of what we ask our soldiers to do, and because of what they go off and do on our behalf so that the rest of us don't have to, they suffer more than the rest of the population from issues like mental health issues and substance abuse and family problems, because they're separated, because they're under stress, because they suffer from PTSD. So to suggest that it might not be a great idea to put every one of those folks and tell every one of them, just because you carry this ID card, you're fit to carry a concealed weapon, is not at all demeaning or degrading to folks in the military. It's just reality. Now, I know that there's a school of thought among some of us here that everybody ought to carry a gun all the time, everywhere they go, and nobody ought to question their ability to do that. And I understand that that's the belief that we're trying to get a little closer to as we create a special category of folks here. And I understand and I believe that our soldiers who we send off to war and are combat ready ought to have a right to defend themselves by whatever means they deem appropriate for them. But you also have to understand that not everybody who carries a military ID card is fit for service. Military commanders carry a list of at-risk soldiers. And those folks aren't combat ready. Those folks don't carry weapons on post. They're not allowed to because they're at risk. I'm very concerned about the safety, the physical well-being of our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guard members. And right now, one of the biggest threats that they face is suicide. Suicide rates in the military are twice what they are in the civilian population. And the reserves, hundreds of active duty and reservists kill themselves every year. And one of the major risk factors is the availability of lethal means. Because they can get their hands on firearms, their suicide attempts are much more likely to be successful. So I don't think this solves a problem. I do think it puts our soldiers and sailors that are suffering, that are under a lot of stress, it puts them at greater risk by making those handguns, those weapons, those lethal means of suicide more available. I called some of my colleagues looking for more stories about folks, my former JAG colleagues, and some of them were still on active duty. Asked them for some stories of folks that you wouldn't want to have carrying around a concealed carry permit that you'd worked with or you'd defended or you'd prosecuted. And the reaction from every one of them is, what, you guys want to do what? This is not a good idea. I understand that on its surface, it seems like a pretty nice thing to do, and we're going to be pro-military, and that's what we ought to be doing. But you've got to look a little deeper at this issue. This hasn't been thought out. This isn't really, I know it's a message bill for you all. I know that it's a free bill for a lot of you. I get to do a pro-gun bill. I know the governor's going to veto it. I don't have to worry about this policy becoming law, but I want you to really consider seriously what you're doing here, whether this is really a good idea, whether this is really something we ought to make the policy of the Commonwealth of Virginia. I would hope, after thinking about that this bill would not pass. You'll vote no on this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman Culpeper, Ms. Freitas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking to the bill.
Gentleman has the floor.
I think part of the problem with some of the gentleman's comments is the fact that, we have this tendency, or I should say certain people, sometimes certain members of certain political entities, have this tendency to treat all veterans, especially combat veterans, as if they're some sort of ticking time bomb, as if they're victims of war. And as a result, they have to be watched much closer than anybody else in society. The bottom line is that while we have been at war for over 15 years now, veterans actually do an excellent job of getting out of the military and coming back into civilian life and reincorporating themselves back into their families, back into their jobs, etc. And if the whole idea of wanting people to be able to carry concealed is based off of we want people to carry concealed that have gone through appropriate training, well, the vast majority of the military, and I recognize that there are some people in the military that go through weapons familiarization as opposed to more robust weapons training, but the vast majority of them go through significant weapons training. Not to mention the fact that at the heart of this is that these were men and women who got training, who went overseas, especially over the last, close to 2 decades now, that we were going to put in harm's way. We were going to trust them. And not just with the small weapons we carry around back here, but with the big scary weapons, the 50 caliber machine guns, the anti-tank weapons. We trusted them with those, but now all of a sudden when they get back home, that's when we want to view them with skepticism. Oh, you're a potential ticking time bomb. The Lautenberg Amendment prevents you from carrying a weapon in the military if you're found guilty of domestic violence. So this whole idea that all of a sudden we're opening something up to where any sort of veteran or any sort of, active duty military member who's been accused or has been convicted of other things is now going to be able to carry concealed simply because that military ID card isn't true. And in the meantime, once again, I am watching someone treat members of the military, especially those that have been underseas, like, well, we've just got to watch these guys with additional scrutiny. They can't be trusted. I don't appreciate that. I don't appreciate that because at the end of the day, they went through more than most people have ever done in order to prove that they know how to handle a weapon, and they've went through all that training to also prove that they can be trusted with it. And again, if we're going to send them overseas to defend all of our rights to be able to get a concealed carry permit, I think they've proved that they're also trustworthy in that respect as well. So if they've gone through, if they've been convicted of something additionally, great. Treat them different then, not because they're an active duty member of the military and you're worried about they might commit suicide or you're worried that they might perpetrate a crime on someone. If they've done something that they've been guilty of, fine, treat them that way. But let's not identify them as being members of the military. Somehow that makes them an additional threat or concern. I think, again, they've gone through the training. They've demonstrated a desire to protect others. And I think that this bill is perfectly appropriate and admires their service. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman, Prince William, Mr. Lingenfelder.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Briefly. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, gentleman said this bill wasn't thought through. Let me tell you what was thought through. What was thought through was the oath that these service people took to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States from all enemies, foreign and domestic. Let me tell you what was thought through. The oath that they said that they would follow orders, that they would go into combat for this nation, that they would protect our national interests. Let me tell you that what was thought through. When they took that oath and that obligation, they were ready to leave their families and maybe never come home. Let me tell you what was thought through. They understood that they might have to walk away from their jobs, like many National Guard members of this Commonwealth are right now serving in Iraq. This has been thought through, folks. This is a good bill. And if you respect the military and you trust them and you understand what they're ready to do for you, you'll vote yes on this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Shall the bill pass? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 67, noes 32.
Ayes 67, noes 32. The bill is passed.